Stack sizes and stack-to-pot ratio, pre-flop planning. Stack-to-pot ratio is your commitment map. Stack-to-pot ratio, or stack-to-pot ratio, is the effective stack divided by the pot going to the flop. You use stack-to-pot ratio pre-flop to decide how often you can stack off post-flop without lighting expected value on fire. This is not theory trivia. This is how you stop hope poker in online pools. Core definition. Stack-to-pot ratio equals effective stack divided by pot on flop. Low stack-to-pot ratio means fewer streets and more forced commitment. High stack-to-pot ratio means more streets, more leverage, and more equity realization. Problems. First, stack-to-pot ratio 1 to 3. You are playing for stacks with many top pair and overpair classes. Second, stack-to-pot ratio 4 to 8. Commitment becomes texture and range dependent. Third, stack-to-pot ratio 9+. Bluff-catching gets expensive and R dominates raw equity. Pre-flop stack size buckets. Online cash is not one game. Your stack size changes your range shape and your post-flop plan. Multi-tabling makes this even more important because you need a repeatable commitment model. First, 20 big blinds to 40 big blinds, low, stack-to-pot ratio, single raised pots. 3 bets create near auto commitment. Second, 50 big blinds to 100 big blinds, the standard. You can still play clean, but mistakes cost a full stack. Third, 125 big blinds to 200 big blinds plus, deep stack. Small pre-flop errors compound across streets. Rake drag punishes wide, passive pre-flop lines that fail to realize equity. If tracking software shows you are losing in the blinds, your stack-to-pot ratio planning is usually broken. Single raised pots in position, button or cutoff versus big blind. You open, big blind calls. The pot is medium and the stack-to-pot ratio is usually high at 100 big blinds. Your job is to keep your range structurally strong while keeping your post-flop plan simple. In position, you can run more polarized ranges on later streets because you control pot size. Pre-flop, you still start mostly linear versus polarized ranges. Decisions by position and rake. First, linear open ranges benefit because they carry higher average equity and cleaner R. Second, polarized pressure lines appear post-flop, not because you open trash pre-flop. At higher stack-to-pot ratio, your bluff candidates want strong backdoors and good blockers and unblockers. Hands like 8-7. Suited can apply pressure because they unblock folds and realize equity with position. Scenario box. Hero. Hand, 8 of spades. 7 of spades, button, 100 big blinds. Big blind calls. Flop. King of clubs, 6 of hearts. 2 of spades. Pot 5.5 big blinds. Effective 97 big blinds. Stack-to-pot ratio about 17. Action, big blind checks. You must pick a sizing that protects your range and your future barrels. At stack-to-pot ratio 17, you do not get to bet and hope. You choose between equity denial and building a bluff line. Small C bets increase your range bet frequency and leverage your position for later polarized turns. First, bet small when your range is advantaged and you want to keep more hands in your betting range. Second, check some backdoors to protect your checking range and avoid becoming capped versus uncapped. If you always bet here, your check range becomes capped and strong regulars will overstab turns. The poker place. Exploit framework. First, the exploit versus fit or fold. Big blinds, small C bet, high frequency, and barrel favorable turns. Second, the risk, over C betting creates auto profit. Check raises for aggressive opponents. Third, the counter, add checks with backdoors and strengthen your check back range. 3-bet pots and forced commitment. 3-bet pots compress stack-to-pot ratio. This is where pre-flop planning becomes non-negotiable. If you 3-bet and then refuse to build a stack-off range, you are leaking expected value. Your range construction shifts based on position and opponent tendencies. In position, you can 3-bet more polarized. Out of position, you prefer more linear versus polarized ranges. First, Out of position, linear, 3 bets keep your equity high and protect R under pressure. Second, in position polarized. 3 bets use suited wheel and suited connector classes as bluffs. With lower stack-to-pot ratio, your value region expands into strong top pair and overpairs. With higher stack-to-pot ratio, those hands lose stack off value and become pot control candidates. Scenario box. Hero hand, king of clubs. Jack of diamonds, small blind, 100 big blinds. Button opens, you 3 bet. Button calls. Flop, jack of pets, 7 of clubs. 3 of spades, pot is large. Stack to pot ratio is now in the mid-single digits. Action, you see bet. Button calls. Turn decisions decide if you are committed or controlled. Out of position, you are structurally at risk because in position realizes equity better. King-Jack offsuit is a classic R-trap hand. It has decent equity, but can lose big at the wrong stack-to-pot ratio. First, on low stack-to-pot ratio runouts, you can value bet and get stacks in versus worse Jack-X in draws. Second, on high danger turns, you must avoid building a pot that forces thin stacks. Your goal is to avoid becoming capped versus uncapped by overchecking turns that you need to defend. When you bet and face raises, use blockers and unblockers to choose continue candidates. The poker place. Exploit framework. First, the exploit versus call-heavy button. Size up for value because low stack-to-pot ratio forces their mistakes. Second, the risk, overvaluing one pair versus a tight range that is not over-defending. Third, the counter. If button starts raising turns, tighten your value bets and add trap checks. MDF and Y stack-to-pot ratio changes. Defense. Minimum defense frequency or minimum defense frequency is your baseline to avoid getting auto-exploited by bets. Stack-to-pot ratio determines how much each streak costs, and that affects realistic defense. At high stack-to-pot ratio, defending too wide destroys your session because future bets compound. At low stack-to-pot ratio, folding too much lets opponents print with small bets. First, high stack-to-pot ratio, you defend tighter and prioritize hands with better R and clean runouts. Second, low stack-to-pot ratio, you defend closer to theoretical minimum defense frequency because realization is less complex. If you multi-table, you need simple rules, not memory-based guesses. Your default defense plan should be based on stack-to-pot ratio and range interaction, not vibes. The poker place exploit framework. First, the exploit versus small bet spammers defend closer to minimum defense frequency when stack-to-pot ratio is low. Second, the risk over-defending at high stack-to-pot ratio because you feel priced in. Third, the counter, if they start overbarreling, tighten, early street, continues to protect your river expected value. Stop set mining without the math. Calling with small pairs just to flop a set is a leak when stack-to-pot ratio is wrong. You need implied odds, position, and a plan versus squeezes and C-bets. First, pocket fours performs best when stacks are deep and ranges are wide because you can win a big pot. Second, pocket fours performs poorly in 3-bet pots out of position because R collapses and you overfold. Online pools punish passive set mining because rake eats the small wins and variance spikes. If your plan is call pre-flop and fold flop, you are paying rake to donate. Scenario box. Hero hand, 4 of hearts, 4 of clubs, big blind, 100 big blinds. Cutoff opens, you call. Flop. Ace of spades, 9 of hearts, 2 of diamonds. Pot is small. Stack-to-pot ratio is very high. Action, you check. Cutoff, C-bets. You must decide if you have a profitable continue plan. With pocket fours, you have low equity and low R. Folding is often correct. Your pre-flop call is justified only if you win big pots when you hit and avoid leaks when you miss. The poker place exploit framework. First, the exploit versus high C bet regulars. Tighten low pocket pair flats out of position unless stacks are deep. Second, the risk, overfolding blinds and letting them steal too profitably. Third, the counter. Add 3 bets or floats with better blockers and unblockers and higher R. Pre-flop checklist to lock in your stack-to-pot ratio plan. Before you click call or 3-bet, you should know the flop stack-to-pot ratio you are building. This is how you remove random post-flop decisions and increase win rate under time pressure. First, what is the effective stack and what will the pot be on the flop? Second, will my hand class realize equity at this stack-to-pot ratio, especially out of position? Third, is my range capped versus uncapped after this line? Fourth, do I have the right linear versus polarized ranges shape for this opponent? Fifth, which future barrels will I have based on blockers and unblockers? The poker place. Exploit framework. First, the exploit punish players who ignore stack-to-pot ratio by forcing them into low R calls out of position. Second, the risk building pots too fast versus opponents who are under-bluffing later streets. Third, the counter if they tighten, widen steals, and shift to thinner value with cleaner runouts. The poker place. Key takeaway. Stack-to-pot ratio is not a post-flop concept. It is a pre-flop commitment decision. If you cannot name the stack-to-pot ratio you are creating, you are guessing, and online pools will tax you through rake and pressure. Now, let's test your edge. Question 1. What is the core formula for stack-to-pot ratio as defined in the article? Answer: stack-to-pot ratio equals effective stack divided by pot on flop. Explanation: the article defines stack-to-pot ratio as the effective stack divided by the pot size going to the flop. Question 2. According to the stack-to-pot ratio ranges listed, at what stack-to-pot ratio do you commonly play for stacks with many top pair and overpair classes? Answer: stack-to-pot ratio 1:3. Explanation: the article states that at stack-to-pot ratio 1:3 you are often playing for stacks with many top pair and overpair hand classes. Question 3. In the button versus big blind single raised pot example, pot 5.5 big blinds, effective 97 big blinds, what stack-to-pot ratio does the article estimate? Answer: about 17. Explanation: the scenario box explicitly notes that the flop stack-to-pot ratio is about 17 for that spot. Question 4. How does the article say stack-to-pot ratio changes your minimum defense frequency-based defense approach at high versus low? Stack-to-pot ratio. Answer: high stack-to-pot ratio, defend tighter and prioritize better equity realization. Low stack-to-pot ratio, defend closer to theoretical minimum defense frequency because realization is less complex. Explanation: the article explains that high stack-to-pot ratio makes future bets compound, so overdefending is costly, while low stack-to-pot ratio makes folding too much easy to exploit. Question 5. In the stop set mining without the math section, why does the article say set mining with small pairs performs poorly in 3-bet pots when you are out of position? Answer: because equity realization collapses and you overfold. Explanation: the text notes that small pairs do poorly out of position in 3-bet pots since realization drops under pressure, leading to too many forced folds. Study hard, play smart. That's it for now. I'll see you in the next lesson.